Good morning. This is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here with the team from the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, Kaying and Michelle. How y'all doing today?
Fantastic. Thank you for having us, Kenneth.
Doing well.
Great. Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm so excited to talk to you all for Asian American Heritage Month and to learn more about the Asian experience, especially within Minneapolis public schools. And so I'm going to actually kick it over to y'all because I know you prepared a presentation to share. And so I'll share my screen and you all can lead it or take us through it.
Okay. Thank you, Kenneth. I think I'll just do the very quick presentation, then Michelle and I can both have a conversation with you. So I'll try to be as quick as possible. Again, my name is Gaiying Yang, and I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships with the Coalition of Asian American Leaders. We also go by CAL. We are a social justice network organization that brings over 4,000 Asian American leaders from across sectors, ethnic groups, and generations together to harness our collective power to ensure that Minnesota works well for Asian Americans, but for all communities in Minnesota. Next, please. I just want to thank the AAC for having us, the Advancing Education Coalition for having us. It is Asian American Heritage Month. May was chosen because to commemorate the immigration of Japanese to the United States on May 7th in 1843, a long time ago, and also to mark the anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10th, 1869. And many of you know, if you have ethnic studies, which unfortunately we don't have in K through 12 yet, but if you know about Asian American history, the majority of the workers were Chinese immigrants. And so we're really pleased that now more and more people are starting to understand why Asian Americans have been a part of the American fabric for such a long time. Next, please. I also want to say that this is not something new. In 1977, Congress had already started proclaiming May as Asian Pacific American Heritage Week, and then it wasn't until 1992 that Congress passed a law to make it to annually designate May as Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. The name has changed a lot from AAPIs to Asian Pacific Islanders, and now it's Asian Americans Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Heritage Month because we want to clearly acknowledge our Native Hawaiian community and our Pacific Islanders as well too. So next, please. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Asian American population in Minnesota. We have about 300,000 Asian Pacific Islanders in our community. Southeast Asian people from Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Burma make up the largest Asian population in Minnesota. This is very unique, unlike California, New York, or other states. So we should embrace the diversity of this community. The Hmong population make up the largest Asian population here in the state of Minnesota. Then we have Asian Indians and Chinese. I want to point out the diversity within these range of communities too, that the majority of Southeast Asians who came to this country came as political refugees after the 1970s, Vietnam conflict. And then our Asian Indians and Chinese come to Minnesota as highly skilled workers. And so naturally the experiences are very different, but we all share, our identity as Asians. And so I will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. I also want to add that the majority of our Asian populations are quite young, especially in Southeast Asians. And so we have about 88,000 people who are in public schools and colleges and universities. And this is why education was chosen as one of the priorities for Cal. Next, please. This is what you usually see when you go to the dashboard at our Minnesota Department of Education is our graduation rates. And knowing the diversity that we have in our community, we are often disappointed and troubled by the fact that there isn't any lack of disaggregate data for the diversity within the community. You can see here that students who identify as Asians are graduating at a very high rate, similar to white students. So if you only see this data, you will conclude that Asian students have no problems and we should not be including any equity discussions. That's why Cal exists, because we don't believe in that. You can see here that the purple represents non-Hispanic whites, the blue is Asian Pacific Islanders, and then the gray is all students, right? And so too often, this is the only data that we see. And even though many Asians may be graduating high school on time, when the data is disaggregated, we see that 1/3 of limited English proficient students do not graduate on time. And like all other students who have multi-rich languages at home, are too often tracked into EL, which is EL program is fine. We support EL, but too many US born students are still tracked into EL, and we would like the EL program to be much more rigorous and addressing, and supporting students who have multilingual background, right? So, and so despite being in the US for nearly 50 years, large numbers of Hmong students born in the US are still screened into EL. And so many parents are feeling very unhappy about that. Here we now are honing into the Minneapolis public schools. We estimate, this is data from St. Paul, but this is from Minneapolis in 2017, I believe, or in 18. There was about 2,311 students who identify Asians in Minnesota, in MPS. This makes up about 6% of the MPS total student population. Within the Asian student population, you see the breakdown that 28% of them receive English learner support, 57% qualify for free reduced lunch, 11% for special education, and 12% are identified as advanced learners. So if you look at this, if you cross-tabulate this data, we know that EL students are not graduating on time, and yet the aggregate data is misleading a lot of the we're experiencing here. If large numbers of our population are free reduced lunch, and there's a lot of other issues related to poverty that we don't see when we just look at the aggregated data. Next, please. Of the total student population, I just want to break this down a little bit, that 49% of the students are at Hmong International Academy. Henry High School has 32%, Bryn Mawr, and so on. So you can see the breakdown. There's only a couple of sites in North Minneapolis that has large numbers of Asian Americans, and I would have to say Hmong Americans. Next, please. And so because we don't have disaggregated data, which means the data are broken down within each of the Asian American categories, we often use the home language survey and the home language as a proxy. So you can see here the large numbers of folks identify themselves as either just English speakers, so that means they only speak English, and or 39% say they speak Hmong. So we at least know that the largest student population does speak Hmong, and then we have smaller numbers who speak Vietnamese and Lao here. So because we don't have this aggregated data by ethnicity, we often use these kinds of proxy. This data is really important. You saw that the aggregate data tells us that Asian Americans are doing extremely well and are graduating very high. But when we look at the ACT score, and we all know that Minnesota always boasts itself as having the highest ACT score of 23, highest in the nation, that when we disaggregate the data, it looks very different for our Asian, Black, Indigenous communities. And for even Asians, it's been at an average of 16 for the last many years. And so this should be concerning to many of the educators and advocates in our community. Next, please. Again, I want to just demonstrate that even though our systems say we cannot disaggregate data, there's been moments in our education history that we've been able to do it. And this is just one opportunity in 2011 where the MCA reading results were disaggregated, and you can take a look at the diversity within the Asian population. On top is South Asian. Their reading proficiency is 86.9%. Remember that the majority of South Asians come to this country as highly skilled workers, so they already have a lot of education in their own country, and perhaps their children as well too. So when they come to this country, they're at a different at a different academic knowledge than a lot of the other Southeast Asians. If you go down to the bottom, you see the Burmese, or I would have to say Karen, because the largest Karen population is in Minnesota. their reading proficiency is a lot lower, but they've also been in this country less time. So we'll give them a few more years to see where the data goes. But the Hmong, again, who have been in this country for nearly 50 years are still faring very poorly at 46.6%. And again, this is something that we need to dive a little bit deeper. Next, please. So in 2016, Cal led a coalition of 40-some organizations to pass the All Kids Count Act. And this law is now in the books. So all school districts should be disaggregating data, although we know that it's been very challenging for every school district to do this. It basically allows parents now the option to indicate within each of these ethnic communities, for example, 7 of the most populous Hispanic or Latino groups, 7 of the most populous Asian and Pacific Islander groups, and we included Karen as well too, 5 of the most populous Black and African heritage groups, and 3 of the most populous Native American groups. So if you're Black, you have now the opportunity to say you're African American, Somali, Ethiopian, Liberian, right? Because a Somali student may have EL needs, while an African American student may not have. And for the Asian population, now we can say we're Hmong or Filipino, or one of the 7 most populous. Next, please. I just want to show you very quick. This is from MDE, the guidance for MDE to each school district. They can use a form similar to this or a form that's separate. And again, for the state of Minnesota, it is optional. So we encourage all parents to indicate, what ethnicity. And if you're a mixed ethnicity, you can choose all that apply down below as well too. So next, please. This was the first set of data from the 5 rollout sites that agreed to disaggregate student data. The caveat here is that the data is still so small, so it's not being publicized and used a lot, but already it's telling us the diversity within each of our racial population. And so you can see on the left is the Native Americans. You see the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe communities students are the most here. And if you look on the right, it's the reading proficiency. Again, the one in the blue is, we see that the largest numbers of students are Hmong, but we have large numbers of other community students as well as Karen, right? And then on the right-hand side, you see the reading proficiency, and you will see that Chinese, if you just look at the Asian population, you see that Chinese the reading proficiency is very high, but when you look at the Hmong, it's 45.9%. So again, we want the data to be disaggregated so that we can share where the policymakers and school districts can use this data to help inform where they should prioritize some of their resources. Yes, again, I just wanted to show the other population here, but okay, next please. So at the, in conclusion, I just want to say that we firmly believe that, without data, without disaggregated data, equity cannot be achieved because we don't see the disparities within all communities. And so, one of the biggest challenge for us in the Asian American community is this model minority myth, which says that, Asian Americans are doing quite well. They're exceeding in many different areas. And so we worry that, if the model minority continues to be used, then it's pitting us against other racial communities, and it's harder for us to work in solidarity with communities to make sure that issues that are experienced by our communities are then, that data can help us seek solutions to very difficult issues such as educational achievement gaps and so on and so forth. So that's a really big and quick and dirty overview of what's happening in our communities. And I know we have a few more minutes left, so let's spend maybe the next 5-10 minutes to just kind of have a conversation with Kenneth, and I will make sure that I am texting my next meeting to let them know I'm going to be a little bit late. So,
well, I wanted to actually thank you so much for that, Kaying. I thought that was great. But Michelle, I wanted to see if you had anything that you wanted to add. What stands out to you as you, hear that presentation? What are things that you want to make sure folks hear and listen to?
Yeah, I think the other thing, I think that you did a great job doing an overview of the data. I think another thing that we should pay attention to right now is just that because of like the after effects of the pandemic and the language being used by the previous president, there's there's just been an increase in anti-Asian hate across the country. Not to say that this hasn't been happening before to our Asian students or our Asian Minnesotans, but there's been an increase of reporting, and I think it's a combination of the rise in anti-Asian hate, and also that that we feel as an Asian population that we have more of a voice, and we want to make it clear that there's violence happening to us. I'm sorry, there's construction in my background, but I think that's just one thing to take note of is as our students are going back to school, how is the school districts making sure that they are protected?
Yeah. And so, I think we all have different thoughts around like what does hate look like? How are people experiencing hate in different ways, right? Like we know there's just a lot of different ways that it can kind of rear its ugly head. Then I'm not saying like let's dig into it and pull apart really painful experiences and things that you all are aware of, but just generally, like when we think about what's happening in our schools, like can you help us understand like what people should be aware of is happening in our schools, and how like the anti-Asian hate is taking place within Minneapolis public schools, if it's taking place within Minneapolis public schools? And again, you don't need to give a specific example, but just generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is the interpersonal, experiences, but also the systemic, racism that's happening, and the model minority myth is one of them. And the fact that when we look at this data and that you see that Asians are doing quite well, perpetuates everyone's stereotype about Asians being the best students and hardworking and so forth. We may be hardworking, but we're still struggling through the systemic issues that is part of the system and not us, right? And so the model minority myth is one way. The other is that yes, the derogatory language that was used to describe COVID-19 is also continue to stir up hate in the communities. But part of that hate is because of the model minority myth as well too, that seeing that Asian Americans are not struggling means that other communities of color and white communities don't feel like Asian Americans should be at the table when we talk about equity. And this is really harmful not only to us, but to the other communities too, because then it prevents us from working in solidarity with other communities, right? And it misleads other communities to think that more resources are being spent on Asian Americans when it's not being spent. And in fact, we continue to be invisible. If a child is acting out in a classroom, Asian Americans who are well-behaved are overlooked, but they may be struggling and failing in a classroom, but because they're just quiet and behaving well, then they get a passing grade. That is a disservice to Asian students, right? Because when they graduate, they're not going to be college ready or prepared. And so we're trying to tell the school districts that they cannot continue to mask the invisibility and the disparities of a community by just putting out aggregate data, but to look much more deeply into data that's broken down and that's much more specific. If they don't know how to interpret the data, that's why we're here, so that we can look at the data together and do the analysis together.
Yeah.
But yes, there are cases of Asian hate in Minneapolis School District. Again, because we are seen as quiet, the school district is not doing very much about it, and we worry that it's going to be swept under this is a problem, right?
Yeah. I think that's such a powerful point, because I think so often when we think about like biases and like how people's biases can work against a certain community or certain person, we think about like, oh, you know what, like we see one community as like misbehaving or loud or whatever, and so then that will then lead people to have like more interactions with the police, or more interactions with, or more disproportionate suspensions and all this kind of stuff, or less of an ability to give them the benefit of the doubt on like grading or on assignments being turned in. But if it's also happening in the opposite, right? And we have, our Asian community who is seen as the model minority and is seen, maybe like the stereotypes around like our Asian community is very different and seen as like the model minority and how you should behave or whatever, then all of a sudden you have things that go ignored, and you have things that are disregarded. And then you have this social promotion that takes place, and you're given the benefit of the doubt, not necessarily because you don't deserve it, but you're ignoring the need that's being presented, right? And I think that's such an important thing to say. Like, biases don't allow us to see a person for what they need and what they bring to the table, right? And I think that's important too. Like, what are the assets that you bring to our classroom, and not just the, what are the deficits that you may have, or what, how else we need to provide additional support. So I just think that's a really important point that you bring up, Kaying.
And yeah, and I want to build on the assets perspective, because like I said, we are troubled by the fact that systemically, every time a Hmong person or Spanish speaker or Somali speaker indicates that they speak Hmong or Spanish or Somali at home, they're automatically then screened for EL services, right? And so again, this is a systemic problem, and that we don't see these languages, the ability to speak multiple languages, as an asset, but seeing it as a deficit, and then put in EL. And the EL programs have historically been created for new arrivals who just arrived in this country. But when you're, second or third generation born in this country, you're still tracked into EL. That's a problem, right? That's a systemic problem. And then what we are really pleased about is that MPS did create the Heritage Hmong language programs. And so we want them to invest more in these, because science tells us and lived experience tells us that the more you use your own native language, right, academic outcome is a lot better. And so we believe that to exit EL students, you need to have strong heritage language programs, not Spanish for white students, but Spanish for heritage speakers, right? Or native languages for native indigenous communities. And so this is the reason why, if you disaggregate the data, the district would then see that this is actually an asset and that they can build on these programs and invest more resources, and not just do as a one-off to make communities quiet, but to really say, hey, this is a real investment. I already showed you that the majority of Asians in Minnesota are Southeast Asians. We come with a lot of languages. And so if we can build on that, imagine the young people in the future and how they could build this economy if they continue to speak their own languages and English fluently. And the global community that we are becoming, how much of that we can invest in our community, instead of bringing, in addition to bringing other workers to Minnesota as well too. So this is something that we keep harping on, because we believe that there is a lot of assets and we want the school districts to do better.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Michelle, I wanted to give you one opportunity to give one final thought before we wrap up. So yeah, Michelle, what do you have to add?
I think when you were talking about biases, I just thought about how important it is for like our communities, like the Black and Asian and Latinx communities, to be in solidarity with each other, because that's why our communities are pitted against each other, because we're the quiet Asians, and then like Black folks are like they disrupt class, but that's how our communities are pitted against each other. But this is why it's important for us to work together, because there's systems that are racist against all of us, but just in different ways.
Yeah, 100%. And that's a beautiful reason to explain why AC has come together so that we can build that solidarity across racial, cultural lines, and really figure out like, how can we get a system that works together for all of us, and not just, given one little thing to be quiet and one little thing but like it actually needs to serve us all. So I want to say thank you all so much for giving us this time today, and just teaching us and helping us learn so much more. Happy Asian American Heritage Month, and we'll talk to you soon. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.